Welcome to our study of the book of Daniel, session 3. We finished with Daniel chapter 2 and verse 6 last time. So now let's pick up with verses 7 through 11. It says, "They answered a second time and said, 'Let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we will declare the interpretation.' The king replied, 'I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen that the command from me is firm. That if you do not make the dream known to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. Therefore tell me the dream, that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation.' The Chaldeans answered the king and said, 'There is not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, for there is no one else who could declare it to the king except gods, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh.'" Well, in these verses, the wise men, the Chaldeans, admit their inability to provide what the king wants, saying that only the gods had such knowledge or power. And they get a little, I guess you could say, a little testy with the king, being a little bold, I guess, saying that no king on earth has ever asked such a thing of his advisors. So that's I think an interesting point. But let's move on then to verses 12 and 13, or actually we'll read 12 through 15. Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious, and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He said to Arioch, the king's commander, 'For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?' Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter." Well, here we see a glimpse of the real character of Nebuchadnezzar. He was a man who could go into a rage when his will was not carried out, when he didn't get what he wanted. And this helps us appreciate the courage of Daniel and his friends when they had earlier refused to eat the food and drink that was assigned by the king back in chapter 1. Now, the king's decree to kill all the wise men was perhaps limited to the city of Babylon. That may or may not be the case, but this decree obviously included the killing of Daniel and his friends, even though they had nothing to do with this up to this point. And again, this just simply shows what Nebuchadnezzar was really like. He's going to kill people who had, if you're going to get mad and kill people on the spur of the moment, at least kill the ones who were directly involved, and not every single person of that title or of that job, so to speak, even though they had nothing to do with it. But again, this would show his real character, and it shows what can happen when someone gets so far away from God that they let their emotions and their feelings control them. They get to the point where they lose all control. in certain situations. You know, I mean, you look back in history and you see men with that type of uh, attitude. You know, Hitler. People got to the point where even, you know, his advisors, his military leaders were afraid of him. And there was at least one, maybe more, assassination attempts because they knew he was crazy. You know, Saddam Hussein supposedly had the same type of attitude and mindset. So, and we've known of others throughout history. People were afraid to be around them. All right, verses 16 through 18. So Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, about the matter, so that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Well, Daniel's response to this is to go before the king to ask for time to know and explain the king's dream. He explained the situation to his Hebrew friends, companions, and asked them to pray to Jehovah about the matter, that the secret might be revealed and the lives of these young men might be spared. What do we learn from this? Well, we learn of Daniel's great faith in God. We learn that Daniel was a man of prayer. We will see again in chapter 6 where it is stated that he prayed 3 times daily. You know, in direct contradiction to the law that would be in place at that time, that no prayers should be offered to anyone except the king. Again, we'll look at more detail in that in chapter 6, but another thing that we should see here in this in these passages is that there are times when we as human beings we forget to pray. We let life come in on us and take us away from the most important things. And the only time it turns out that we end up praying is when we're in a jam, when we're having problems, and we forget to pray during the good times. Well, Daniel is not one of those people. Daniel did not pray only during those times when he was having problems. He prayed all the time. Again, we'll see that more clearly in chapter 6. All right, verses 19 through 23. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel said, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever. For wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you have made known to me what we requested of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter." Now, so God reveals the secret, which was the king's dream, to Daniel in a vision. And what does Daniel do? He thanks God. He thanks the Lord for revealing this matter to him. Now, we've talked about it before, but here we see inspired scripture speaking of this idea that God removes kings and establishes kings. He removes kings and he sets up kings. He is the one who brings nations up and brings them down. So again, as I've said before, I believe God is still doing that. I just don't have inspired revelation to say, this particular instance is God working and doing what He does, or that particular instance is God bringing a nation down, or this particular instance is God bringing a nation up and establishing it. We have things like that here in Daniel and other places where God told us, this is what I'm doing. This is how I'm doing it. But even though we don't have God telling us specifics, I believe generally we can understand that He still works in the kingdoms of men. Excuse me, the nations and the governments of today. Now we're going to see this idea again in chapter 4 and verse 17. Notice also that Daniel gives God credit. He thanks God and he praises God for knowing all things. So he speaks to God's omniscience, that He is the one who gives wisdom and understanding. If we read in the book of James, there in chapter 1, I believe it is, where it says that a person should pray to God for wisdom. And we might not always like the way that God gives us wisdom, but all wisdom, all true wisdom comes from God. I say we may not like the way God gives us wisdom sometimes, because sometimes we go through troubles and trials, and in doing so we learn, and therefore we gain wisdom as to what to do or what not to do the next time these things come along. Let's come to chapter 2, verses 24 through 30. Chapter 2, verses 24 through 30. Therefore Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and spoke to him as follows: Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me into the king's presence, and I will declare the interpretation to the king. Then Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows: I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known to the king. Then the king said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered before the king and said, As for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and He has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream, and the visions in your mind while on your bed. As for you, O king, while on your bed, your thoughts turn to what would take place in the future. And He who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me more than in any other living man, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. Now, again, we see here that Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that the Lord God would reveal the dream's meaning, and had to Daniel at this point. Daniel will give it in the following verses. And he repeats again the idea that the wise men of Babylon had said before, that the secret of the king's dream was beyond the knowledge and power of so-called wise men. Even Daniel himself admitted that it's not my wisdom, it's God's wisdom. And therefore he says there is a God in heaven that reveals mysteries or secrets in verse 28. So what do we see from these verses? Number one, we have a clear statement. There is a God in heaven. You know, we read in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The Bible starts in the very first verse of the Bible with an assumption that God exists. But later on in Scripture there will be things that prove God's existence, such as prophecy, the other miracles, not just prophecy, but God's protection of His people, God's destruction of their enemies, the miracles of healing and so forth that man cannot do. The different things, the different types of miracles throughout Scripture. Then you have not only the things that are supernatural, but you also have the product of the supernatural, such as creation. Psalm 19, verses 1 through 4, basically say that the heavens declare the glory of God. The very fact that these things exist around us, excuse me, show that there is a higher power, that there is a force beyond this world. Now, you know, the specifics of who that force is are found only in God's revelation, the Bible. But a person can look at the creation and at least know that there is a power beyond this world. In fact, Paul makes the same statement, or gives the same idea in Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 20 says, for the wrath of God is revealed, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. The New American Standard translates the next verse this way. It says, for since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Now, the word that is translated since, for since the creation of the world, it's a word that can have the idea, you know, the word, as they translated the word since, for since the creation of the world, that kind of has to do with time. But some have made the argument that the word should be translated from, which is really the basic meaning of the word, okay, that it should be translated from in the sense of this is what we get from the existence of the creation, from the things that are created. The very idea that the creation itself shows God's invisible attributes, such as His eternal power. I mean, only something with infinite power could bring into existence the things around us. I mean, to me, the night sky is probably the most beautiful thing in the creation of God. At least that is to me. You know, the second most beautiful thing would be the green grass and the trees, and you know, the springtime and the summertime when everything is green and alive. The beauty of God's creation. But I think what trumps the daytime look, the daytime beauty, is the nighttime beauty. Because every single star that we think we're looking at, I say every single star, a lot of what we look at in the sky that we think are stars are actually other galaxies. And the very idea of billions upon billions and trillions of stars outside of the Milky Way galaxy, okay, outside of the galaxy that we're in. I'll have to go back and look to make sure that what the name of our galaxy is. I've forgotten it all of a sudden. But outside of our galaxy are untold numbers of other galaxies. and you know, just take the planets, for instance. The very idea of every single one of these bodies, these planets, moving in such a way that they are in their own orbits. They're circling the sun just like the Earth is, and we can tell because their orbits are so precise, whether it be the planets or the moon or whatever. We can know exactly where those things are going to be at any minute of the day as they move through their orbits. And we can, you know, fire a spacecraft into space and have it sent in such a way that it misses every single thing that is out there. So, you know, to see that and to know those things, and then to say, well, it's just the product of some big bang, some big explosion, and everything just went out there and and started moving in perfect unison, in the way that they do. And again, that's just talking about the movement of things in space. It's not talking about the beauty. It's not talking about the excuse me, all the other things. How creatures and creation work together to help each other. The idea of symbiosis, you know, living together, you know, one creature doing something that aids another creature. You know, all of this is supposed to have evolved, and according to modern science, and that's just the likelihood of that is, if I've understood it right, the likelihood of that is greater than the likelihood of a tornado blowing through a junkyard and coming up with or spitting out a perfectly functioning 747 airplane. You know, what's the likelihood of that ever happening? Well, it's astronomical. Well, it's even more unlikely that all the things we see around us in creation just came about from chance. So it's excuse me, it's something that is just mind-boggling. Well, again, you know, God is the one who created all things, and these things are part of the proof that God exists. Another passage besides Romans chapter 1 is Acts chapter 17 and verse 24. It says, "The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands." So Paul preaching on Mars Hill at Athens, saying it was God who did all these things. It was God who made the world. So we see from Daniel 2 and these other passages there is a God in heaven. Also, what we've already stated, we learn again the God of heaven knows all. He knows the secrets. Deuteronomy 29:29 says that the secret things belong to God. Another passage is 1 John chapter 3 and verse 20. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 20. Let's start with verse 19. Says, we will know by this that we are of the truth, and will assure our heart before him in whatever our heart condemns us, for God is greater than our heart and knows all things. So God, the God of heaven, knows all. Jehovah God. And then the God of heaven reveals secrets. Daniel gives credit to Jehovah. He does not take credit for himself. We see again this type of behavior in this type of gratitude and giving credit to God in Joseph back in Genesis 40 and Genesis 41, where Pharaoh has a dream and he does not remember the dream, and Joseph says, it's the God of heaven that reveals these things, not me. Now, later on in verse 47, Nebuchadnezzar is going to admit that Jehovah has this great power. And we'll talk more about that when we get to verse 47. So, one last thing we'll say about these verses is that Daniel says in verse 29, he says, "As for you, O king, while on your bed your thoughts turn to what would take place in the future." So what the king saw in his dream were matters that would take place in the future, and God would make those future matters and events known to the king through Daniel. So let's keep that in mind as we look through the rest of chapter 2 and talk about the interpretation of these things. Again, these things are for the future. That is, from the time of Daniel into the future. Sometime in the future, these things are going to take place. All right. Chapter 2, let's read verses 31 to 45. 31 to 45. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time, and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand, and has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. After you there will arise another kingdom inferior to you, then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. Then there will be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. In that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom. But it will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong, and part of it will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, and it will itself endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. Now, there's a lot of information in these verses, and we're going to go through it. Daniel relates and explains Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Verses 31 to 35 record just what the king saw in his dream. An awesome image whose body was made up of different elements, and a stone cut out without hands that struck the image and then became a great mountain and filled up the whole earth. And then verses 38 to 45 are the explanation and interpretation of the dream. Nebuchadnezzar's actual dream involved these aspects. It was an image with a head of gold, breast and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, feet part of iron and part of clay. And then again you have the stone cut out without hands. Now the wind carried away all of the metals and elements, iron, clay, brass, silver, and gold. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Verse 37 reveals these things about the Lord God. Number one, we've already seen it, but verse 37 says God exists. There is a God in heaven. The second thing that we see about God in verse 37 is that God is a giver. Okay? You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom. He's a giver. Although there are times when he does take away, God's basic nature is one of being a giver. The king had a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. Why? Because God is the one who gave it to him. All the king's possession and authority came from God. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's dream involved 5 kingdoms. That is, the kingdom that God gave to Nebuchadnezzar. That's the first one. There was another kingdom, a third kingdom, a fourth kingdom, and then finally there is the 5th kingdom, which shall never be destroyed. Now, let's go through each of these things and detail them out. Nebuchadnezzar's actual dream starts with a head of gold. This was the kingdom that God gave to Nebuchadnezzar. Again, verses 37 and 38, specifically verse 38, you are this head of gold. Now that's the Babylonian Empire. It ruled from 605 to 538. Okay, the Babylonian Empire was in place from 605 to 538. Now, it existed prior to that, but as far as the ruling empire, when it finally defeated Assyria, this occurred in 605. And then the Medes and Persians would defeat the Babylonians in 538. Well, that next then is the 2nd kingdom, the breast and arms of silver. This is the other kingdom that is talked about in verse 39. It is the Medo-Persian kingdom, and it was in place from 538 to 333 BC. 538 to 333 BC. Then we have a 3rd kingdom, the belly and thighs of brass. This is a 3rd kingdom, and it would be the Greek kingdom, the Grecian empire. This would be in place from 333 to 63 BC. 333 to 63 BC. Excuse me. And then we have the 4th kingdom. This would be the legs of iron, the feet part of iron, and the part of clay. This would be the Roman kingdom. And the Roman Empire existed from 63 BC up to 476 AD. Okay, 63 BC to AD 476. Finally, there is the 5th kingdom. This is represented by the stone that was cut out without hands. And it struck the image of metal, and then it became a great mountain and filled the earth. This is described in verse 44 as a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And verse 44 recognizes or identifies this kingdom as the kingdom of God. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. Now, before we go on with some things, I want to make sure that we see something here that that's going to be, I guess you could say, repeated in this book. Note in chapter 2 that we see an image with 4 parts. In chapter 7, we're going to see Daniel's vision of 4 great beasts. In each instance, chapter 2 and chapter 7, in each instance, the meaning is the same. 4 world empires: the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. That's the way we're going to understand chapter 7. That's the way we're going to explain it. And I know that there are different interpretations out there. But we believe that there is a pattern. And we'll look at that and notice the lessons from it. Now let's jump ahead in time for a moment and note that that Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, Galatians 4 and verse 4 in the New Testament, states that Jesus came into the world in the fullness of time. That is to say that the time was right for Jesus to come into the world. Now, someone might surmise or ask the question, why did not Jesus come, earlier, in the days of Abraham, in the days of the kings of Israel, and so forth? Why didn't he come during the time of the Old Testament? Because the time was not right. Things were not in place to make the coming of Christ to this world what it should be. Well, with that in mind, let's look at some things that each of these kingdoms provided that made the coming of Christ and the spread of the gospel what it was in the first century. First, let's look at the Babylonian Empire. During the time of the Babylonians, the Jews were scattered. The Jews had been scattered, the northern kingdom, by the Assyrian Empire in 722, but the southern kingdom were taken to Babylon. The kingdom was taken to Babylon, and they were there for 70 years. And when the time came to return, not everybody returned. So not everybody was in Jerusalem around the temple that was rebuilt during the time of Zerubbabel and so forth. So what did they do to worship? Well, it was during this time that the Jewish synagogue arose, during the Babylonian Empire and the time coming after that. It was during this time that the Jewish synagogue came into being. And what that meant was is that, especially as you go through the New Testament and you read especially the book of Acts, what do you see happening? You see Paul and others going into each city, and the first place they go is the synagogue. So the synagogues made a great place for the early disciples to go and to teach the Word. You have Jesus' statement in Acts chapter 1 where it says that you will go from Judea to Samaria and then to the rest of the world. Paul says that the gospel was for the Jew first and also the Greek. So, taking these two ideas together, every time an apostle or an evangelist went into a new city, the first place they went was the synagogue, because the gospel was supposed to go to the Jews first. Not only did it go to the Jews first in the fact that it was preached first in Jerusalem, but it also went to the Jews first in that the synagogue in each city was the first place the gospel was preached. So, the Babylonian Empire produced, or at least the time of the Babylonian Empire, produced the synagogue. Now, another thing that the synagogue did for us is that the idea of assembly worship, that is, coming together to assemble to worship, was in some respect like that of the church. And not only did you have the idea of assembling, but you also had the idea of different things taking place during that assembly. There was the reading of the Word, there was the explanation of the Word, there was singing, and other things. And so therefore this provided somewhat of a pattern for the early church, and that pattern became law, so to speak, by the way it was done in the early church, by their example and their approved examples and so forth, and commands. So the Babylonian Empire, talking about the fullness of time for Jesus to come, the Babylonian Empire, or at least that time frame, provided us with the synagogue. Secondly, the Medo-Persian Empire provided us a lofty concept of law and order. If you look here in the book of Daniel, and also in other places in the Old Testament, such as Ezra or Esther specifically, you have the idea that the law of the Medes and Persians could not be altered, could not be changed. When you come to the book of Esther, you see that Haman wants to destroy the Jews, and he gets the king to sign a declaration, a law stating that all Jews would be killed on a certain day. Well, when Esther convinced the king to do something about that, you should notice that the king did not go back and undo or change or annul the law that he had signed. He couldn't do that. Even the king could not change the law. The law of the Medes and Persians could not be altered. It could not be changed. So what he had to do was he had to make another law that said that the Jews could defend themselves. So the law of killing the Jews was still in place, but there was also a law that allowed the Jews to defend themselves, and therefore the Jews gained the upper hand. So again, what did the Medo-Persian Empire provide to us as far as the right time for Christ to come? The idea of an unchangeable law, and the fact that, the idea of God's law being unchangeable. I mean, that was true prior to that time. But it became, I guess you could say, more set in stone with the world understanding that concept, because the Medo-Persian Empire was huge, and people within it came to accept and understand the idea of an unchangeable law. All right, the third kingdom was the Greek kingdom or empire. What did they provide for us, or for the opportunity for Christ to come at the right time, in the fullness of time? Well, they provided the Greek language. The idea that all mankind could speak or read in the same language. Up to this time, there really wasn't a universal language. There was a diplomatic language, a court language that we talked about earlier, the Aramaic. But that was for kings and diplomats and scribes and so forth. The common man, spoke in the language in which they were born. But when the Greeks came on the scene, they took Greek culture and the Greek language everywhere they went. And it basically became the language of all common man. Okay, in fact, there was classical Greek, which was prior to the time of Christ, and then there's what's called Koine Greek, common Greek. That was the language of the common person. So they took the Greek language into the world. Finally, there is the Roman Empire. What did they provide for the fullness of time of Christ? Well, there was first a high standard of Roman citizenship. The idea of being a citizen of a kingdom, of an empire. The idea that citizenship, at least in the case of Paul and probably others, but we know in the case of Paul, that citizenship opened doors for him to take the gospel in front of even Caesar himself. He was able to proclaim the gospel because of his Roman citizenship. And several within the household of Caesar were converted. If you read through Paul's letters, you will see that. The second thing that the Romans provided was good roads and transportation. If you go throughout the world, especially in Britain and throughout Europe and Italy and other places, you will find still to this day Roman roads in existence. And they're not necessarily used, although some may be, but they're still there. And it provided not only a good travel base, the idea of being able to travel well and travel fast, even though, today we would not consider them, nice surfaces to ride upon or so forth, but they were an infinite improvement upon what was before them. And they were so well constructed, and that was my point I was trying to make. They were so well constructed that some of them are still in existence today. So the ease of travel, the quickness of the travel to get from one place to another, this would have been a product of the Roman Empire. A third thing that was the product of the Roman Empire was what is titled Pax Romana. Okay, Pax Romana. What is that? The peace of Rome. In early days, there was a great deal of, or a great lack of safety, you might say, on roads and in traveling. The idea of traveling through uninhabited places, what was called in the New Testament desert places, brought a great deal of danger. And if a person traveled one place to another, they took their life in their hands. Not only was it likely that they would be robbed, but very likely that they would be beaten and even killed. So what did Rome do about that? Well, they pretty much did away with a lot of that. Their garrisons and their forts, I guess, for lack of a better word, placed throughout the empire, brought a safety and a peace to where they ruled. And therefore, again, the very idea of the spread of the gospel in relative safety was a big deal. And that's not to say that the Roman Empire stamped out all all people who would secret themselves by the road and try to rob people. Paul spoke of being in danger of those type of people. But let's just say that it was greatly reduced, that kind of thing went on, and other things, you know. I mean, it was a big deal. If you look at the trial of Jesus, it was a huge deal to Pilate that he keep the peace in Jerusalem, and the very idea that if he had insurrection or rebellion under his rule, then he would possibly lose his governorship, or even his life, if he could not keep the peace. So the peace of Rome, Pax Romana, was a big deal during that time. Now, we're going to stop here because I've got a lot to discuss about this fifth kingdom. I'm going to have a great deal of material about this, and I don't want to have to start it in these last 3 or 4 minutes of this session and then have to stop. So we'll stop here, and as always, if you have any questions, just let me know. Thank you.